thank you, Ms. Glöckler and Professor Fuchs in the morning. He gave us a very interesting and instructive information indeed. And my first message is, when hearing all your talks and presentations, the bill cannot be made without the host, the child's brain. And that's what pupils and students should learn, also the youth should learn. The bill cannot be made without the host, the child's brain, but nobody will know what really happens in the brain, indeed. And my second message is time and space are most necessary prerequisites for performing cognitive functions in the brain. The physiological coupling of structure and function are basic mechanisms during early development, and not only up to 7 years, as we heard. We have to give the child plenty of time and an education which is based on natural analog conditions for establishing a healthy ecosystem also in the brain. Yes, we have we develop up from birth, we develop an ecosystem also in the brain. We must know it. And the heaviest challenge of digital media just go on time and space. And that's, I will make it very easy. It's, in the moment it may be complex for you, but I will make easy. And therefore, that you should not believe these things, but understand it, really understand, or what I will say. I will give you the 2 theses of the last century that have given us this assurance for our interpretations in neurobiological labs. I, for myself, worked for 40 years in the lab and worked to learning mechanisms and psychosis. And my question is indeed, will we create a new generation becoming intelligent or not? Will we have a new generation becoming intelligent or not? And you must know what is going on in the brain for this, but nobody will know it. And in half an hour, it is very short, but I must summarize it, and I will try. And the 2 theories I have to present you are Donald Hebb. He postulated a theory of activity-induced synaptic plasticity in a cell assembly, and this assumed cell assembly was unmasked in his following years by brain researchers and as a functional module in the cortex. And it has been shown that we have 40 million of these modules, 1 millimeter in diameter and containing about 200 neurons, and one neuron can create up to 40,000 synaptic connections. 40,000 if it will become indeed intelligent, but whipping over the screen, it will not become intelligent, and that is what I will show you. And Hebb also, his postulate of activities-induced synaptic plasticity was described then as a long-term potentiation receptor system. And I briefly say an ecosystem, an eco answer, but this eco answer involves a molecular change, a cascade of molecular changes, what researchers, molecular neurobiology researchers looked for about 40 years now. And now we know it very well, what happens in the brain when one single info passes through this receptor system. And briefly we call it learning synapse. I say Hebbian learning synapse now. And the second message is coming from Joachim Wolff in '84, and he postulated the theory of compensation and coupling of structure and function, not a correlation between malfunction, behavioral malfunction, and screening, but a coupling. In brain, a coupling, not a correlation indeed, and that's what I will point out now. And the compensation means something When the brain starts to organize already in intrauterine time, it organizes excitatory, inhibitory, competing balances. Neurons were nothing more than competing excitation and inhibitory excitement. Nothing else. They have no idea. Idea comes from the outside, and Wolf postulated a really genial idea that this produces degrading processes, and during the degradation and ongoing of synaptogenesis, meaning synapse formation and reorganization, just environment can take influence on reorganization processes. It was very intelligent, this idea, and we have proven it now for 40 years, and that's the way. Really, the brain is an ecosystem, and it's internalized, and not only up to the age of 6 years, but also up to the age of 16. Then you can start. That was not necessary to present us. They can start up 16 years onward, indeed, but not before, because the time before, all is internalized and not forgotten for all time, and they will not become intelligent. And now I will show you what he means with self-organization and coupling by neuroplasticity and brain rhythms. These two researches are the prominent researches in our labs up to date. We ourselves worked with neuroplasticity, and neurophysiologists work with rhythms, brain rhythms, endogenous activity. Well, now the first slide. You will know a representation of body theme in the brain. Everyone knows it from a lecture book, and we see that only after birth, the brain, these areas here, produce a representation according to the activity pattern, an enlarged pattern for tongue and face and hand, and a reduced pattern also for the body and the legs. And you know the example of Contagan children, and they gave us an interesting hint what happens by neuroplasticity in early development. What happens is that Contagan children who were born without hands and fingers, they could learn activity dependent to write, and later also to chip into the machine with their feet, tools here, by claiming these unsoluble areas. Yes, and this will mean that these areas here in the neighborhood of the language area for associative language formation, the Wernicke area, and here the Broca for motor, premotor activation. And just in front of these fields, we organize hands and writing and a bit run. Oh, thank you very much. We organize writing for hands and thinking. We pre-organize areas for hands and thinking. Yes, my third thesis, I have 12 theses, you can have them afterwards, from Miss Glöckler. I go this speech make this speech with 12 theses, and my third thesis now is enriched activation of functional modules and synaptic contacts in early maturation of somatosensory cortex, means grasping forces the understanding. We know it from brain researches. And what you can see here, just I pick out one functional module and show the enriched maturation of interactions in one cell, only in one cell, and the impoverished maturation by whipping over the screen in early childhood. Only a small number will be organized in early time. And the fourth message therefore is parents should be aware that the primary contact spectrum cannot be established at later developmental stages, since sensory and motor cortex areas mature for a limited period of time. Digital games have a counterproductive effect on the pre-adaptation of associative cortical fields. Well, that's the introduction, I mean, and the more difficult thing is now to understand the organization of the representation of time and space, and that this doesn't work only in early childhood, but throughout childhood up to the age of 16. I can represent you now. That's what we worked with for 20 years in University of Bielefeld. Well, I start with showing you a picture from nature as an ecosystem, where also these theories of the Hebbian plasticity and the Walsh compensation and coupling of structure and function are really organized. And at here at the right, you see tall trees, beeches, and at the left, growing up from same beech bones, buckercuts, growing up from same, only crinkled beech bushes. And these crinkled beech bushes have their habitus from the permanent stress from sea, meaning winds and storms, throughout their early childhood when they grow up. And nothing else we have in the highest brain center in our forebrain during childhood when it will become stressed this way. And this whipping is a permanent stress on highest brain modules. And therefore, the prefrontal cortex is to organize social behavior, historical thinking, formation of long-term memory, control of emotions and conflicts, to become concentrated, and so on. And now I jump into the forebrain and show again this glutamatergic cell, from which we have about 60 in one module of the 40 millions of modules. And the neurons, this pyramidal glutamate exciting neurons, are maturing in two layers. And these deep layer maturing occurs about just from birth, but this maturing starts from pre-teens. You must know. And now what will happen when, the normal activity is that activity flow takes this way. Here we have the learning synapse, the Hebbian synapse, which produces an echo effect, and the activity will pass this way and forward the changed power here by U fibers into other modules. And on this way, it becomes modulated by GABAergic interneurons and by dopaminergic interneurons. And dopamine bring up quite another information than local GABA interneurons. They produce an information from brainstem, from whole brainstem. And they have the peculiarity that they mature very superior prolonged. They are not mature before the age of 18 years. We quantified this with immunohistochemical methods with more than 2-3 theses. And we got agreement from another researcher who studied this also immunohistochemically, Carlsberg, in primates. A very superior prolonged maturation. And now one must know that GABA inhibition and dopamine inhibition compete with each other for producing a balance range of excitement for these pyramidal cells. And this is a highly critical thing throughout these early time, up to 14, 16 years of age. And yes, and what recently could be shown in context with psychosis researchers, that just the subgroup of these cells here, so-called basket cells, construct a high wave we call gamma activity, about 30 Hertz frequencies. And this must come into interference with 4 Hertz frequencies coming by dopamine fibers, and additionally with 4 to 8 Hertz frequencies coming from hippocampal activities. And only when this happens, we get a window of presence, as Pöppel has formulated already 30 years ago, which lasts for 2 to 4 minutes only, and it is timed. And during this open window, we get so-called phasic synchronization throughout the whole cortex. And that's what occurs when we consciously think. And thinking then is nothing else than abstract and logical process against the background of time and space. And when time and space cannot become organized, we will not can speak, we will not produce a phasic synchronization in this high brain area, and this means the children become virtualized, starting from virtualized forebrain areas. But that's not all what I can say to this. We produce, that is our researchers, we produce somewhat similar, like this crinkled, when children are challenged very early, we produce changing features of these neurons, and quite differentiated changing of interaction between GABA, which compete for the activity pattern. Dopamine will go away to a high degree, and GABA will increase, and that means the door shuts to the brainstem. It gets no influence, and we cannot repair it afterwards, when this will happen by a traumatization in early childhood, but it's a gradual influence. Also, screening means challenging the brain of the child. We produce crinkled beach bushes. My sixth thesis is that users will lose the necessary basis for social and other communications, since neurochemical metabolic processes and high order rhythms will not become synchronized in their coordinated activity patterns. And the next one, brain arrhythmias have recently become the #1 common disease, also in our adulthood. Make your child intelligent. Therefore, parents should make sure that their children, even throughout adolescence, always have a healthy sleep. That's the most necessary to think. Yet now I must explain still what happens with addiction, what this will mean in the brain. And for that now we need the whole brain and a systemic interpretation of the whole brain. Well, the activity flow comes from the forebrain, and just a pattern is organized now. During you have a conscious regarding of this. Everyone has another actualized pattern now. And also the other side will, the lateralized effects go on, because what we know, a better frequency actualizes the other side. And that's very necessary, because my speaking comes from serial pattern of organization, of neural organization. And the unconscious pattern occurs by parallel circuits. And it's quite necessary that just children who learn writing and speech have to, that's what Steiner and others always have said, but now we can show it in brain development, that they have to force to promote also the parallel circuits by board games or anything like this. Parents should encourage the child to play an instrument, sing in a car, and teachers should give a lot of opportunities for two-handed games and to learn slow thinking. And I recommend this book of Kahneman, Slow and Quick Thinking, to a very big book. Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for this, 3 or 4 years ago now. And he shows that slow thinking means recollection thinking, thinking at the present, the past, and the future. By thinking, very deep thinking, internalizing serial activation patterns as parallel activation patterns. And superficial, quick thinking means superficial thinking. And this is damned to produce a lot of mistakes, indeed. And to produce this, he shows a lot of examples in this big book what goes wrong by superficial thinking in the brain. And just this is promoted by sweeping over the slab, not only up to 6 years, indeed, but also in 10 and 12 and 14-year-old pupils. Well, and now vestibular system, it's so necessary also that body activities will activate cortical areas, and the way that goes is shown now here. Vestibular system and other motor sensitive organs stimulate the organization, the early organization of cerebellum, for motor learning, and this 3 coordinates of our surrounding is just organized in early childhood, and therefore my 9th thesis must be, since the maturation of vestibular and cellular circuits dominate motor functions in childhood, tumbling and running are indispensable prerequisites for developing mental abilities and even prepare networks for later thinking in mathematical categories. To have good surrounding and environmental experiences in early childhood up to about 10 to 12 years. A critical period for lateralized function is in preteen, up from 6 to 9 years. It's very interesting then to introduce in school two-handed games and so on. That's a critical period. Well, and now, and then by motor functions, this activity also promotes the motor and premotor activities. And then now the most interesting thing, what happens when addiction occurs? Well, the normal process is that we have all sensory activities pass this central system we call the hippocampal system. The hippocampal system generates alertness, attention, emotionality, formation of short-term memory, space withholding. And that just for what O'Keefe and Moses got the Nobel Prize now 2 years ago, and it was a political Nobel Prize, I'm sure, to give advice what happens now with our societies by acceleration with screens in childhood and youth. And I will explain at first the normal activity pattern. Here we have a high accumulation of Hebbian learning synapses, and it demands the intelligence of the teacher indeed to open this door in his pupils. And when he will open this door, and also I have to open your door now to the hippocampal system, you must become aware to listen to this. And then I can only summarize the hippocampal, which produces a theta activity and high synaptic plasticity throughout life. Here, the Wolff's compensation is realized throughout life. We have a germinative layer producing lifelong, also in our brains, a new building of neurons and forming new synapses. And therefore, we can be aware and can learn also in our ages now. And that's what we worked for 20 years about, for this plasticity here. And in the combination with amygdala, this system produces also emotionality and awareness. Well, and now look what happens. Yes, normally the theta activates the maturation also in prefrontal cortex. And indirectly, it activates the prefrontal cortex by the very superior prolonged maturation of dopamine into this area. But at the same time, early in childhood, we have the maturation of limbic dopamine system back to the hippocampus. I always call it a bypass of the hippocampus. And all what I say now occurs under the threshold of consciousness. What I told now, consciousness comes in the brain only by prefrontal cortex. And prefrontal cortex has not the activity pattern to produce this consciousness in childhood and early adolescence. And what happens now is a reinforcement by this bypass here, and this is forced, and storage for reinforcement. And it's a bad reward system is not okay, because it only needs one time to see the mother screening, the baby will do it, indeed. Because just this entrances here, the object recognition and assignment to coordinates in space are organized up from life. It's something like imprinting in the newborn child. It must recognize the mother's face, and face-to-face interaction starts by this path here, this pathway, and activates this self-reinforcing system and opioid receptors, and therefore the child becomes addiction to mother. One can say it's very, very necessary. It becomes addiction to mother and father in early childhood, indeed. But now, what happens when medial screening stress occurs? Then very quickly the child develops here a reinforcement and adapts opioid receptors. Once seeing, it adapts automatically, it adapts this self-reinforcement for an addiction. And now what happens is that this forces the theta to the prefrontal cortex, and this means that in a prefrontal cortex, what occurs is a recommendation maturation, was Notreifung, an emergency maturation here dopamine cannot develop and it produces an emergency maturation of the functional modules in the prefrontal cortex. Yes, I forgot to give the nicest and most important message from Albert Einstein. It's so right. He knew nothing from the brain, and he knew the essential thing of the brain already, yeah? That's interesting. Learning is experiencing. Every else is information and not learning. And children and adolescents must learn and not get information. It's like this. I cannot say anything else. And now the production of emergency maturation, and we researched for this, you can believe, for about 20 years. We quantified all enriched environment and impoverished environment, and also challenge in early childhood, traumatizing the early child. And we can say that then dopamine, for dopamine, the door is shut. The forebrain will not accept it later on. And in the severest form, this is psychosis. And in a somewhat lower severe form, it's virtualization of children, what happens today. And we will not see it long. Our society will not bear it any longer, I think. In several years, we will see the disaster, the whole disaster of what happens now. Yes, I wanted to, I have to shut now. I wanted only to summarize the very superior prolonged maturation of dopamine up to young adulthood, and beyond adolescence is comparable. Indeed, these are results from animal model, yes, but nevertheless we can translate it in so far that we can say maturation pattern goes on beyond pre-adolescence up to young adulthood. It was shown also for primates. And interesting, the limbic, this maturation pattern of this dopamine projection naturally has an overshoot production. And stressing the early childhood, this overshoot production will not be taken away because this feedback cannot occur, because the dopamine maturation is dimmed in prefrontal cortex, and this produces a surplus value throughout life. And therefore, this new generation produces a heavier potential for this reward system, and becoming an addiction very earlier than during normal development, but because the control of emotions and conflicts emerging from prefrontal functional models, this control cannot occur in digitalized children. It's really, it's so severe that I'm ready, that I'm thankful to you that I can bring the message and that you hear to it for this half an hour. It's so complex. I summarized it very quickly, excuse me, and therefore I'm too quick also in reading, because I was anxious I will not come to the end in this time. And yes, and this will mean that the last thing, that under the consciousness, this circuit reward system is hyper-innervated throughout life, and this big prefrontal circuit, taking this long way over consciousness, will not be producible, is hypo-innervated. And now my last messages, therefore, are very bescheiden messages. Parents can only become a role model again and turn away the addiction risk of their child if they themselves renounce screen-based media as far as possible in their private life. I myself have no Navi, have no handy, no smartphone, nothing. And I'm happy as in former times, very happy in my life without these shredder. And the 12th thesis is only permanently trained muscles indeed perform well. Everyone knows it. But also only the greatest possible self-activation of the cerebellum, accomplishes mental performance. Therefore, my recommendation is Lübke English.